Hi, everyone. My name is Ramona Harvey. I am a happiness and leadership coach, and I'm excited to talk to you today about how do we feel more empowered as women? How can we build an optimism that actually sustains us going forward? How can we maintain a positive frame of mind that we can constantly keep on so that we can really feel empowered to start, continue, and keep pushing through the projects that we have in a way that we don't get caught up in our thinking patterns, especially those that tend to be pessimistic and in a space of self doubt. This comes up a lot with my clients, and I found that what works the most when it comes to addressing this sort of pessimistic thoughts that we find ourselves as having, even if, and maybe especially when we are doing something that we really, really care about. I was just on a call this morning with a client, and I heard her speak about the same exact self doubt thinking patterns that I myself experience and that every single one of you probably experiences at some point. I know that most of my clients, if not all of my clients, um, are experiencing a lot of self-doubt when it comes to doing something that we really, really care about. The higher the stakes, the more the self-doubt kicks in, and the more pessimistic thoughts come in, even for someone who might describe themselves as optimistic. Now, if you are not an optimist by nature, then I would say that this talk is even more impactful or even more useful for you. But I would say for all of us, right? We all experience patterns of thinking that tend to tell us, why would this work? This will never work. What makes you think that this is something that you can do? Who are you to do this kind of work? And so on. So there's a lot of kind of negative um, thinking that comes in that really we need to disrupt. We need to acknowledge and we need to disrupt. And there are some specific tools that I found are really, really useful. But before we go in, I wanted to share with you where I got this idea of talking about optimism today. And when I was asked to give a talk around happiness and women's rights, one of the first things that came to mind for me was this part of this interview that I heard of with Michelle Obama, and she was on her book tour talking about the book Becoming. And one of the things that really struck me, among many things, but something that really stuck with me, was when she was asked the question, "Do you feel optimistic? Do you feel optimistic about the nation and the way we are becoming as a nation?" And she had said in the book that she really kind of pushes herself. She really taps into this force that she feels is really connected to something larger and more potent than, ourselves, than elections, than leaders and news stories and so on. And for her, that force, she calls that optimism. She says, this is a form of faith. This is an antidote to fear. So then the question that was asked was, well, do you feel a sense of optimism? And her answer really surprised me, and in a way wasn't what I was hoping she would say. But it really stuck with me, and later I came to understand what I think she meant. And her answer was, we have to feel optimism. We have to feel optimism for our kids. We can't hand them crap. We have to give them hope, right? Fear is false. And our antidote to fear is hope. So, what struck me about that quote, about her answer, is the fact that she didn't say, I absolutely feel optimistic, and here are the reasons why. What she said is, we have to feel optimistic. So that then meant to me that we have choices. All right. We can choose to not feel optimistic, or we can choose to feel optimistic. What lenses do we choose to put on when we think about the future? So when she said we have to be optimistic, I started to really think about, well, how do we do that? How can we? I agree, we have to feel optimistic. How do we do that? And so I spent a lot of time this summer really revisiting some of the work that I had been reading from Martin Seligman, who is considered the father of positive psychology and is someone who looked at a concept that in psychology is called learned helplessness. And what's interesting about that term is that is the idea that feeling helpless is something that we learn. So if we can learn, and we do learn to feel helpless, then how do we learn to feel optimistic? How do we learn to really practice this kind of positive thinking? And that goes beyond, positive mantras and positive affirmations, but how do we actually kind of trick our mind into thinking positively? Because we know our mind tricks us. Our mind has a positive, a sort of a negative bias. So how do we balance that out, right? One of the issues with that is that our bad thoughts often go unnoticed. They're really kind of underneath the surface. They kind of keep replaying bad experiences from the past and really projecting them in the future. And what we do is we make assumptions that tend to be negative or sort of put us in a place that seems helpless to us. And what happens is then we feel that it's not really worth continuing, right? To do something if we feel helpless, we kind of feel stuck, right? So the first step then is to kind of really notice, right, these thoughts. So awareness is always the first step, and I always say that being aware of our thoughts, it's most of the work, right? And so once we become aware of kind of these negative thoughts, then we can kind of say to ourselves, well, hold on a second, is this giving me energy, positive energy, or is it draining me? Is this something that is helping me find a solution, or is this kind of stopping me from taking action? Is this actually freeing me, or is this something that is distracting me, and maybe even worse, keeping me stuck? We want to be intentional and pay attention to our thoughts and pick the healthy ones, kind of like we do with our diet. So optimism is a learnable skill. It's really a perspective that we can choose to lean on. And what I love about it is thinking that this sort of perspective really is freeing. So when I think about freedom, in my mind is freedom to sort of dream, freedom to work, freedom to do what I want to do, freedom to follow my intuition, freedom to contribute, freedom to create what I'm here to create. And so in order to feel free, I really need to let go first and foremost of these empowering stories that we all tell ourselves, right? And it's about freedom from that kind of stress and worrying about the future. And so this kind of self-empowering work really replaces this inertia and helplessness. And this is this tendency that we all seem to have to give up, even when it's about something that we really deeply care about, right? So what's also interesting from all this research on happiness that I've been spending the last 6 years on is that happiness, and really optimism as well, is something that we all seem to have a signature genetic range, but that is just a foundation that we build on, right? So it's really, when we think about optimism and sort of positive thinking, is really a building block for increasing our own happiness, our own ability to think in a way that is empowering, to feel good about ourselves, and to feel good about the future and the kinds of things that we can create. So I'm really excited to share with you two really powerful scientifically researched techniques that can really take us from this powerlessness to a sense of hope and to empowerment. And these are tools that will allow us to ultimately keep up with this kind of work that gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. And the way we do this is disrupting our thinking patterns, especially our pessimistic thoughts that we all, I think, understand are rooted in fear, right? Because that fear is really about creating a sense of certainty, a sense of control that we just don't have when we create something. So it's really this ability and this practice to disrupt those disempowering thinking patterns. And so what I found interesting talking to people, because I'm a researcher, I've been a researcher for a long time before I became a coach. And what I found from researching and interviewing a lot of people is that we actually seem to know very little about how to change kind of our own happiness in a sustainable way. And one of the things that I've noticed when I talk to people who describe themselves as happier and optimistic is that they keep raising the bar for themselves, their own views or of what they believe is possible. But what happens is, while we might become really good at really setting the bar high for ourselves, which is definitely sort of a first step, or one of the ways that we get started in creating really great things, is that we tend to kind of backpedal, and we tend to sort of stop ourselves, trip ourselves, doubt ourselves in this process. And so now we have a great vision. We even could come up with ways to, with plans and strategies and tactics to get there, especially for those of us who have our own business. But then how do we really bridge this gap between this vision that we have and even the plan that we have, and a place that we might find ourselves in on the day-to-day, or sometimes when we kind of tell ourselves that we really are not prepared to do this work, that we really have maybe taken on more than we can do, that maybe we stretch ourselves maybe a little too much, and maybe we actually are not capable of doing it. So in contrast, I've seen this kind of growth and transformation that actually people are capable of when they really kind of practice this ability to really change and stop those negative patterns. And so then creating the sense of faith, of trust, of self-confidence, of hope and optimism is something that we can really tackle. So how do we tackle that? Well, it starts with kind of understanding that there are two crucial dimensions really when it comes to optimism in our lives. And it's really exciting to kind of take those apart. One is this idea of permanence versus something that's temporary. And the other is about looking at things in a specific way versus universal. So let me break those down for you, and those will lead to the exercises that I think you will find really useful as practice. So let's take the first lens, and that is when people give up easily on something, what happens is they believe that the causes of bad events that has happened to them are permanent, right? They're always going to be there, right? So this nagging boss is always going to be there to kind of put me down or not acknowledge me and the work that I do. So there's this idea of this thing will always be here. This barrier is always going to be here to stop me, right? So it's sort of assuming that something that has happened, even if it's several past kind of negative events, will keep happening in the future. Now, on the other hand, people who tend to more easily resist this sort of helplessness, these kind of negative assumptions, they really believe that causes of bad events are actually temporary. This thing is going to pass, right? So when you hear things like, "Well, diets never work," right? That's really has this permanence assumption behind it. Or we could say, diets don't work when you eat out, right? So it's kind of really saying it's about this kind of temporary situation, right? Or if I say, I never exercise, I'm never able to keep up with my exercising, that's now saying that this thing is here to stay. But if I say, I just haven't exercised lately because I've been exhausted, I've been taking on a lot of work, that's really acknowledging, it's putting on this kind of wider lens and acknowledging that it's not something, me not exercising is not something permanent. It's just something that is temporary. I've been exhausted, I've been working a lot lately. So this idea that you think about kind of things that you don't like in your life in terms of always or never, they really have this permanence, pessimistic lens on. So on the other hand, if you think in terms of sometimes or lately, when we qualify events in this way, then we kind of are able to put on a more optimistic lens, right? So when something happens and we fail, then we all experience this kind of helplessness. But it can be momentary, right? So it's kind of like taking a punch in the stomach, and it takes a little bit to recover. Right now, some people recover almost instantaneously, while others really stick with that hurt, right? They can remain helpless for a few days or even months. And even after even small setbacks, some people really may never come back, right? Kind of choose to really make that bad event or failure a permanent thing. So what I find is interesting is that this happens also for good events. And this is really surprising even for those of us who consider ourselves optimistic. There is this tendency that we might have to kind of say, I got this client, or I got this project, or this presentation went really well. Oh, it was my lucky day. I was just lucky. Rather than saying, I'm always lucky. So you can see how when it comes to a positive event, the tendency is actually to make it not permanent if we put on a pessimistic perspective. The tendency is to actually make it temporary. Oh, it was my lucky day. So what are we doing here? Is we're explaining good events to ourselves in terms of something that's temporary. Now, what do people who put on a more optimistic perspective, who really practice that, and for whom maybe that's even natural? Well, what happens is they say, well, I'm always lucky, even if it just happened, once or twice. Or they'll say, oh, I'm really talented, right? So it's really interesting that we can put this sort of pessimistic perspective and really kind of almost stop ourselves. And what research is showing is that when we think that kind of this good thing that just happened is just a temporary thing and will probably not happen again, we believe it was a fluke, then we're even less likely to try harder next time around, right? So let me give you an example. I have when I first started coaching, I got a corporate client who knew me from my previous work as a researcher. And I had several people come to me and ask me, hey, that's really amazing. You just got this client in basically the first year of coaching. How did you do that? And so what I said to everyone was, well, that was just a fluke. And worse, it felt as if I couldn't repeat that. So perhaps I couldn't even continue my work or continue building my business because I just got lucky this one time. And then even when I got a second client, I found myself thinking, oh, here's why this was lucky. And then later I started to notice this idea of, my clients, who even someone who just got promoted, would say that was just sort of like a fluke, and it just, they just got lucky, and they will explain to me the exact way in which they didn't control the situation or they didn't contribute. Well, what happens is we can actually learn to own the kinds of successes that we have, and learn to see our contribution to them. In the same way that we can learn to see something that we fail at as something that's temporary, right? There was just a temporary setback. It's something that actually helped me learn something. So these are things that once we become aware and we kind of say to ourselves, wait a second, what am I telling myself right now? And how true is this? Is this really permanent? Is it possible that this could be a temporary failure? Or when I gain something, is it possible that actually I made this happen, right? So what happens is when we think in a negative way, when we think in a way where we have a universal kind of explanation, right, for something, or a permanent explanation for something that was really maybe a temporary setback, we are going to be less likely to try harder. Another set of kind of another perspective that we seem to adopt is this idea of kind of specific versus universal, which works in a very similar way. So think of the kind of permanent versus temporary as really kind of a way that we think in terms of time. How something that happened to us really is seen in terms of a temporary or a permanent, so it has a time measure or way of looking at it. Think of this next way of thinking about our optimism versus a kind of pessimistic perspective as very specific versus universal. So this is kind of more has a space dimension, if you will, rather than a time dimension. So essentially, you can think of this idea of something that is specific, right? So when something, I have a client whose boss is really unfair, right? And so what she would say is, I would hear her say, well, all bosses are unfair, right? Which is really this kind of almost catastrophizing perspective. It's kind of really saying, I can't work for someone. It's really creating this universal perspective, right? Versus what's really happening is that this particular boss, this specific scenario, it's true that boss seems to be unfair. But is it true that all bosses are unfair, right? Or we could say, I would hear my kids say, "Oh, no one likes me." If it's really about really one person who doesn't like her, right? Or oh, I failed this one time, and I say every time I fail, right? So this is really extrapolating and saying that every time I will try something, I will fail, right? So it's kind of this sort of tendency that the problem is really universal, that there's a problem that will sort of penetrate all aspects of our lives, right? So you could see how, for instance, someone who just lost their job recently could say, well, I will never get a job. And worse, they could say, there's something wrong with me. And that kind of belief begins to then show up in more than just the job situation, begins to show up in their personal lives as well. Now, when we think from an optimistic perspective, we really believe that good events will enhance everything that we do, right? So it affects more than just this one aspect, right? So we believe that, the fact that I was really good at this project really means that I'm smart. So I take it, I extrapolate it from just that one specific instance and I make it universal. I'm smart, right? Or, I make a new friend, or with a colleague, um, you know, uh, with an optimistic perspective, I might say, um, I'm a charming person, right? Everyone likes me, right? So there's an art and science to this idea of hope, of looking at things in a way that, can really make us feel more empowered to do something, to continue to do something, right? So if I can find a permanent and a universal cause for all good events in my life, um, um, and I'm able to look at something, a failure, as temporary, right? Or really that has a specific cause, then I'm really in a place where I can feel really empowered to do what I want to do, right? So what we want to say, for instance, is, I made a mistake, rather than saying I'm stupid, and making that kind of universal, kind of statement about ourselves, which can become our identity. If, for instance, we say, my husband and I just had an argument, he was just in a bad mood. Um, we have a specific kind of explanation, rather than saying, oh my God, my marriage is falling apart, right? Or instead of saying, oh, I just got lucky this one time, you can say, I'm talented, or I worked really hard for this, right? So there is a way to really increase the way, those positive feelings, that then can create a sense of optimism. So there are these well-documented methods for really building the sense of optimism, that basically consists of recognizing and then disputing this kind of pessimistic thinking patterns that we all seem to have. And I find it really exciting that we can actually truly increase this kind of sense of optimism and hope, right? Everyone has already the skill of kind of disputing, right? We learn to kind of argue with others. But really, can we do that with our own thoughts? Right. So what if someone, for instance, said to you, you're not really good at your work, right? You always fail. You never get anything done. You're not good enough. You never stick to what you say that you would do, because you never follow through in any area of your life, right? So, however, if we say the same kind of accusing things to ourselves, we don't tend to necessarily dispute them. We just kind of own them. We just believe, even though they're false, right? Like if someone said those things to you, you would find a way to argue with it, with him or her. But when you say that them to yourself, you just tend to own it because you think it, so it must be true, right? So the key to really disputing and really uh, addressing these pessimistic thoughts is, first we got to recognize them, and then we got to treat them as if they were said by someone else. I told you these were surprising tools. Okay, so let's talk about the first method. We call it the ABCDE method. Now, I just want to say that there are a lot of tools out there. And obviously, we can do our meditation. We should do our meditation. We should do our positive mantras and anything that works for you at all. But I wanted to bring something to you that is something that's scientifically tested and proven to really work, because there are a lot of us who kind of tend to be, a little bit skeptical, or for whom those basic kind of tools are not enough to really get us to go from point A to point B, right? To really stick with what we said we're going to do, to really stick with the things that are really, really important to us, right? So I wanted to give you these tools and really show to you how they work, so that you can take these tools, put them in your toolbox, and have them available when you feel that you are about to slow down or about to stop something that you really care about. And especially during these times when we see so many changes beginning to take place, I thought it would be the most appropriate for us to really think about, how do we continue this wave of change that we've begun, as a group of people, right? Maybe as a nation. So I'm really excited about this idea of kind of recognizing pessimistic thoughts and really be able to use this tool to kind of change the way we react, right? To detect these thoughts and to ensure that we keep going, that we are not giving up, okay? And that we feel better ultimately. Okay, so here comes the ABCDE method. So I'm going to tell you what it stands for, and then we're going to go into an example. A stands for adversity. So what is the adverse event or thinking that is happening for you right now? What is it that is really occurring that is something that you feel is kind of making you feel pessimistic, or you feel that maybe the project they're working on or the kind of work that you want to do, you don't feel confident, or worse, you feel that you just will never be able to finish or do. So let's write that down, adversity, and then we'll come back to you doing the actual exercise. B stands for the beliefs that you automatically have when that occurs. Let's go through them. C is kind of the consequence of that belief. D stands for disputing that typical routine belief that you have. And then E, my favorite, is the kind of energy that we feel when we were able to successfully dispute that kind of belief that tends to keep us down, tends to stop us, tends to make us feel that we're not good enough to finish what we wanted to do, okay? So what this requires, though, is that we realize and accept that our beliefs are just that, okay? They're just beliefs. They're just thoughts, repeated thoughts that become beliefs over time that may or may not be facts, okay? So we can really distance ourselves from our own self-accusations that we launch daily at ourselves, okay? When we say to ourselves that when we fail, okay, the kinds of things that we say to ourselves can be just as baseless as the accusations of a jealous coworker or an unfair boss, okay? We have to address those because, they become part of our identity and we believe them to be true, okay? But just because we fear that we're unemployable, let's say, or unlovable or inadequate, it doesn't mean that that's true. Okay, we have to stand back and be able to distance ourselves from this kind of pessimistic, permanent, universal explanations that we have, for at least as long as we feel that we can kind of figure out if those are true or not. So it's kind of sort of putting a stop and putting this distance so we can kind of have some space to really think. And this brings me to how to do this exactly. So tool number 2, and I can't believe I'm recommending this, but this is about learning to argue with yourself. Okay, so how do I argue with myself? First, I want to look to see if I have any evidence for believing what I believe, for that negative belief, for that disempowering belief that I have, right? So if I say to myself, I'm never going to finish because I never finish, I never follow through with the project that I take on. I never achieve my goals because I don't seem to follow through. Okay, I always give up. Whenever I say that whenever I adopt that kind of thinking, that kind of belief, right? What we want to find is an evidence that is actually incorrect. And, we want to find examples when we can really prove to ourselves that that's not true, right? So we have to be a detective, right? So, we have to adopt that role so that we can see that when I say that I'm the worst at what I do, or I'm the worst in my class, or I'm the worst in my team, I really need to now check if that is really true, right? So how do I know that's true, right? So we need to kind of really look for evidence that are really pointing that my kind of thinking, when I put myself down, is really distorted. It's really coming from fear. It's really a tendency to catastrophize that I really need to really stop and disrupt, right? Because that kind of thinking is distorted. It does not represent the truth. It might be true, even, but let's find that if that's actually the case. Because what we often find is that we have a lot of examples of times when we have followed through. So it might be true that sometimes we don't follow through, but if we're able to find evidence that we have actually followed through in the past, now we're creating a case that makes it a lot harder for me to say I never followed through. I hope that makes sense. So first is evidence. Second, in this kind of way of arguing with myself and following through, is kind of looking for alternative way of thinking, right? Is there a way for me to kind of really change the assumption that I have right now? Because most of the time when we have an explanation to ourselves about why something didn't work, or why did I fail, or why something isn't working, I make an assumption about what might have been the cause. And when we put on a pessimistic perspective, we tend to believe that that cause is universal, right? There's something fundamentally wrong about us, and it's permanent. It's always going to happen. So there are multiple causes, right? So why latch on the worst one? And ask yourself if there's any less destructive way to look at this, right? So if you can scan for all positive causes and focus on those that are kind of changeable, focus on things that are specific. Look, I only failed this one time. And things that are non-personal, this has nothing to do with me, right? So maybe when I gave that presentation and it didn't go as well as I wanted it, maybe the audience was particularly unfair or unresponsive. Maybe my boss was in a bad mood. So if we can look for ways in which we can explain that something that happened is changeable. So it was a temporary thing. It is specific, right? So maybe that particular presentation happened to be difficult. Maybe I wasn't prepared enough. Rather than permanent, which would be, I'm just not a good presenter. And non-personal, it's not about me, right? Then we're able to kind of reverse this process of kind of sticking with destructive beliefs that are really not based on evidence. So it's really our job to undo that kind of destructive habit that we have and really create and be creative, right? We have to be creative at generating these alternative explanations, the alternative perspectives that we could take. Okay, so we have evidence, we have alternatives, right? Alternative way of thinking. So a third way of being able to disrupt our thinking patterns, those negative ones that are disempowering, is also looking for what are the implications, right? So there is a possibility, right, that those negative beliefs that you hold about yourself may be true, right? It is possible that, I screwed up in this one project. Absolutely, right? We all do. But the technique here is decatastrophizing, right? So you can ask yourself, okay, so that's true. I did screw up. I didn't prepare enough. What are the implications of thinking that I am not good at my work, right? Or let's take a personal example. Let's say that you have dinner with your partner, right? And it's not as romantic as you would have hoped that it was. Does that imply that you're headed for divorce, right? Or is it really that one time was a bad dinner, right? Or maybe, what we can also do is we can think about what is the implication, right? Like, what is the worst case scenario? Even if what I think is true. Let's say my relationship is bad. If we could put it in a simple kind of negative which it can be, right? Like that could be that it's not a good relationship for you. So then, what is the worst case scenario, right? There. Does that mean that you're never going to recover from it? Does that mean that even if you don't recover, that you're never going to have a good relationship, right? Let's say you lost your job. Does that mean that no one will ever hire you again, that you'll never find another job, right? So what is the consequence? And here it can help to really, the idea here is, of course, to see that even in the worst case scenario, we can still recover, right? So even if we find that, it is true that maybe the relationship we're in or the job we're in is not a good one, what's the worst case scenario? And really see that it's something that we can always recover from. It's something we can always build from, right? So it might help at this point to really look for the evidence, kind of like we did with the first step, looking for evidence and see how correct that is. And what we also want to see is how useful is this, looking at the consequence of what's really happening when I hold this belief, right? Even if it turns out that my assumption is true, how useful is it to hold on to this kind of self-destructive belief, right? So I'll hear my daughter say, well, my teacher is so unfair. It's just, school is just so unfair. World is just so unfair, right? Like we can all sympathize. I can sympathize with that. But the fact that, holding on to that belief that world is unfair, right? The consequence of that is that it's causing me more grief than it's worth, right? And it may stop me or cause me to stop from really trying, right? So the question then is, okay, well, what good will it do for me to dwell on this belief, right? That the world is unfair, that things have never worked up until now, okay? What we want to do, the technique is to really look for, once we understand the consequence, right? And seeing that the consequence is that I dwell on this negative belief, right? We want to look for ways in which we can change the situation in the future, right? So then, even if I believe that, and everything that I fear turns out that is true, turns out that my relationship is bad, turns out that I did get fired, and I was so worried about it. Is this situation unchangeable? Is it possible that it's not unchangeable, that actually is changeable? There is a possibility. So how can we go about changing it, right? So if we feel that the world is unfair, maybe we can decide, right, to stop reading those catastrophic articles that make us feel, that continue to build this idea that the world is unfair and things are never going to get better, right? So we can also look for positive evidence, right? We can look for where we haven't been looking, that things can change, and they do change. We will find that evidence when we start looking. So even if it turns out that what we did was wrong, that we made a mistake, right? We can always choose to view that moment as a wake-up call, right? To spend our energy and finding ways to improve ourselves, right? So what happens is it'll make us feel less frustrated and less angry and more hopeful, and have really a wider perspective when we look for evidence that maybe the world is not as unfair as we thought it is. So, let's say it was true that it was my fault for getting fired. That didn't happen to me personally, but let's say it's true that I didn't get the work done well. Let's say it's true that I didn't put as much time, or that worse, I made a mistake. Maybe we have to just work more or prepare more than we have in the past. So really, let's spend our energy now on updating our skills, right? And really tightening that work, tightening the presentation, and really be more connected to our work. So there's always something that we can do to change, right? Even if it turns out that our assumptions were in fact true. So let's really think about now how do we apply all this kind of disputing, learning to argue with ourselves, to the first exercise, right? So let's think about the ABCDE tool and see how could we kind of illustrate this for yourself. And let me give you an example from me, just to kind of so you can have a sense of how this works. So we start with the adversity. So for instance, a client of mine liked an idea that I had presented and asked me to create another training for their executive team. One of the first beliefs, first thoughts that came up for me was, oh my gosh, I can't believe that he wants me to do another training. This is going to expose me. I'm going to make a fool of myself. And I really just got lucky the first time I did my training. And really, those were not even my ideas. Those were just like ideas that I had read and studied and learned from other people, and things that I had researched. And I really don't think that I have the ability and understanding to really answer those deeper questions that those executives will ask of me. And I'm going to just be humiliated. C is, what are the consequences of this way of thinking, of believing what I believe? Well, first, the consequence was this feeling of just dread, right? The consequence also was that I couldn't concentrate. So instead of spending all this time planning for that training and preparing, I really kept losing my train of thought and ended up doing just busy work, rather than really doing this work that I really knew I wanted to do. D, disputing. So I said to myself, well, hold on a second, right? This is actually a good thing, not a bad thing, right? Like, it's true that I developed that first training doing a lot of research, right? But it's really not realistic to say that those weren't my ideas. And in fact, it was one of my ideas, right, that really resonated and got through and really nailed that training. So not only that, but it would make sense. This is where I validate my own feelings. It makes sense, right, that I feel nervous. What's really happening here is that really anyone would be nervous, right? Presenting in front of a lot of top executives, especially someone who's at the beginning. And, but I've been thinking about this stuff a lot, right, for a long time. And really the reason why my client is asking me to do this in front of these executives is because she has confidence in me. So should I, right? E is the energy that I feel if I can dispute this successfully. Well, after doing that kind of work, and by the way, this is journaling. This is a tool that you can do, and I highly recommend that you do this while journaling. And this is something that we do in coaching sessions when we do one-on-one coaching sessions. But you can do and absolutely should practice this alone at the beginning of your day as you think about your work. And so when you do this disputing, arguing with yourself, and really making a case for yourself so you can build that confidence and own the kind of work that you're capable of doing, and remind yourself that you've done this before, there's this energization, this energy rising that occurs when you've done this successfully. And you'll know that you've done this successfully when you feel that energy. And what happened for me was that I became more focused and just like more calm. And this is the main benefit of kind of disputing our negative, addressing our negative thoughts, is really just feeling calmer, right? And so what happened was I decided to do more research, right, and really practice my presentation. And I actually started to look forward to that challenge, right? I started to kind of tap into what we call that higher self, that best self, who knows that I am capable, who knows that I put in a lot of work already. And really what it takes maybe is more practice. And once I was able to kind of really put on that calm, that more focused kind of perspective, my presentation got better and I became really more coherent in my thoughts. So there's your tool, the ABCDE tool: adversity, please write this down, belief, consequence, disputation and the energization that we feel, right? From doing this, from disputing our own negative thoughts in a successful way. Okay. So, what we want to do is we want to practice disrupting our beliefs vigorously. Okay. So, here's what I want you to do over the next kind of 5 bad events that happen to you or that you experience. I want you to listen closely. Okay. I want you to describe that adversity. I want you to dispute it. Okay. I want you to observe the consequences of that negative belief and really observe the kind of energy that occurs when you succeed in kind of dealing with those negative beliefs, right? And I would love for you if you could send one of those to me. I would love to see how you're able to do that. And so, if you have a rude colleague, right, in a meeting, or your kid leaves their dirty clothes on the floor, like my kids do, or no one returns your call, right? I want you to be able to stop, remember kind of the pessimistic perspective that you can take, right? And remember that if it's something bad, it's something that is temporary. If it's something good, we don't say that we had nothing to do with it. What we say is we have worked for that we earned it, that we are indeed strong and powerful and talented. Okay. It's not just a fluke that we got lucky that one time. Okay. We want to adopt a perspective that is empowering us. We want to dispute anything that's temporary, right, or specific. We want to make them we want to stay motivated. We want to keep those successes coming. So really, what I want to leave you with is that this optimistic perspective, right, is something that we can all take, right? We can become the kind of optimistic people, right, who really take their troubles as being temporary, controllable, and really specific to a specific situation, right? We will move away from the pessimistic perspectives, right, that we can take on, where we believe that our troubles will last forever, right? That that they will undermine everything that we do, that we have no control, right? We can flex those optimism muscles, right, to really cultivate this sense of greater well-being, right? This is a mature defense that we all have. We can indeed become invulnerable to helplessness. We can talk ourselves into hope, out of panic, right? We can get in touch with our own resourcefulness, okay? And I know that this is something that is a practice. It's something that we will continue to do even once we learn it. And hopefully we can say what Michelle Obama said, that there is a force, right, that we can stay connected to, a force that is larger and more potent than what's happening right at this minute. And that is optimism. It's a form of faith and an antidote to fear. Go get them. Thank you for your time.